They said these men would run at the first sound of a German artillery barrage. That black soldiers, men from the streets of Harlem and the back roads of the American South, would crumble the moment real war pressed down on them. German intelligence officers reviewed the reports with something close to amusement. The Americans, already late to the war, were apparently sending regiments of black infantrymen to the Western Front. It struck many in the German high command as almost charitable, giving these men rifles and sending them into a meat grinder the finest European armies had been feeding for 4 years. Some German officers reportedly joked about it over dinner. They had faced the British, the Canadians, the Australians. They had ground down the flower of French manhood in battles so savage that the very names had become synonymous with slaughter. And now they were supposed to fear soldiers that their own American allies openly described as inferior, undisciplined, incapable of sustained combat. They were not afraid. They should have been. Because the regiment that was coming, the one built from the neighborhoods and ambitions of Harlem, New York, would do something no American unit had ever done on the Western Front. They would fight for 191 consecutive days in the trenches of France, never once rotating out, never once breaking, never once surrendering a single prisoner to the enemy. They would earn more individual decorations from the French government than any other American regiment in the entire war. And the Germans, who had laughed, would eventually issue a formal propaganda warning to their own troops about facing these soldiers, calling them ferocious fighters and demanding their men exercise extreme caution. This is the story of the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, and it is one of the most remarkable, most infuriating, most inspiring stories the First World War produced. Imagine yourself standing in Harlem in the summer of 1916. The air is heavy and warm, smelling of coal smoke and frying food, and the particular electricity that comes from too many lives pressed together in too little space. From a basement window, somewhere on 133rd Street, you can hear a piano rolling through a ragtime number, the notes tumbling fast and loose over each other like they have somewhere urgent to be. Children chase each other between delivery wagons. Women in their Sunday best move in clusters, speaking in the musical cadences of the American South, the Caribbean, West Africa. Harlem was already a crossroads in ways that white America hadn't noticed and couldn't yet comprehend. This neighborhood had been transforming for nearly 2 decades. Black Americans were arriving by the thousands, fleeing the grinding brutality of Jim Crow in the South, chasing the possibility of something better in the cities of the North. Harlem had absorbed them, neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, until it had become something extraordinary. A black city within a white city, with its own newspapers, its own churches, its own intellectuals, its own political arguments happening on street corners at 10 in the morning. James Weldon Johnson was writing. W.E.B. Du Bois was thinking and publishing and agitating from his office at the crisis. Marcus Garvey was beginning to draw crowds with his speeches about dignity and black identity and the future. It was a place that believed in itself when very few others did. And in this neighborhood, quietly, on the edge of all this cultural flowering, a military unit had been growing. The 15th New York Infantry Regiment of the New York National Guard, a segregated unit authorized in 1913 and struggling ever since to become something real. It had fought for rifles. It had fought for a training space. It had fought simply to be taken seriously by an American military establishment that believed with a bone-deep certainty that black men were not fit to fight. The man who believed otherwise, who fought the bureaucracy and the indifference and the naked contempt to build this regiment into something that could actually function, was a white attorney named William Hayward. Hayward was from Nebraska. He was politically connected, having worked closely with Theodore Roosevelt. He was also, by the standards of his era, something unusual. A man who looked at his black soldiers and saw simply soldiers. Not a political problem. Not a social experiment. Soldiers. Men who could be trained, equipped, and led into battle if given the chance. Getting that chance required Hayward to fight almost as hard as his men eventually would. He lobbied the War Department for equipment. He was told to wait. He lobbied again. He was told there was nothing available. He called in political favors, made uncomfortable phone calls, walked into offices where he wasn't particularly welcome. Slowly, agonizingly, rifles arrived. Uniforms were issued. Training began. But before we follow these men into the war, we need to understand what they were walking into. And more importantly, what they were walking away from. Imagine yourself now in early 1917. The Great War had been consuming Europe for nearly 3 years, and the word consuming barely captures it. The Western Front stretched for over 400 miles, from the English Channel coast in Belgium down through northeastern France to the Swiss border. It was not a line so much as an open wound, a system of trenches and tunnels and fortifications that had been dug deeper and elaborated upon until the landscape itself had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The original fields and farms and forests were gone, replaced by a moonscape of shell craters, collapsed dugouts, collapsed men, mud that went down 6 feet and smelled like death because it was death, saturated with the bodies of soldiers who had fallen in the first year of the war and never been recovered. The men who lived in these trenches did not talk much about what they had seen. When they wrote home, censors cut the worst of it. When they came back on leave, if they came back, they found that the words simply didn't exist. How do you explain to your mother, sitting in her clean kitchen, what it sounds like when an artillery shell lands close enough to lift you off your feet? How do you describe the smell of a trench that has been occupied for weeks without rotation? How do you convey the particular terror of going over the top, climbing out of the ground that had been protecting you, and walking, upright, toward machine gun positions that could fire 500 rounds per minute? France had lost over 1 million men by 1917. 1 million. Let that settle for a moment. Entire generations of young Frenchmen had been fed into battles like Verdun. 10 months of fighting over a stretch of fortified hills that resulted in roughly 700,000 combined casualties and virtually no meaningful change in the front lines. The French army had actually mutinied in the spring of 1917, with soldiers across multiple divisions refusing to participate in further offensive operations. Not refusing to defend, but refusing to attack into the guns again and again and again for no gain. The mutinies were quietly suppressed, their leaders executed or imprisoned, but the damage had been done. The French army's offensive capacity was shattered. Britain was in scarcely better shape. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 had produced nearly 60,000 British casualties on its first day alone. One day. The Passchendaele offensive later that year added another 250,000 casualties in exchange for a few miles of territory that was mostly churned mud. British commanders kept feeding men into these operations because the military logic of the era demanded it. Wear the enemy down, maintain pressure, force their reserves to exhaustion. The mathematics were brutal, and the results were meager. Then, on April 6, 1917, the United States of America entered the war. The reaction in France and Britain was something close to euphoric relief. America had the men, the industry, the food supplies, the raw materials that the exhausted Allied powers desperately needed. The arrival of American forces would tip the balance. Everyone agreed on that. What remained uncertain was how long it would take to get those forces trained, equipped, and deployed in sufficient numbers to actually make a difference. Germany knew this too, and was already planning to use the window of time before significant American forces arrived to launch one final massive offensive and win the war. For the black men of Harlem, and for black Americans across the country, the declaration of war created something more complicated than relief or enthusiasm. It created a question, and the question had the particular sting of a wound that had never properly healed. Should we fight? Not whether they were capable. On that point, there was no doubt in Harlem. The doubt ran in the other direction. Should men who were systematically denied the rights of American citizenship lay down their lives in defense of that citizenship? Should men who could be lynched in the South for looking at a white woman the wrong way volunteer to go die in France so that white America could feel secure? Should men who couldn't vote in most of the country, who were barred from most professional occupations, who couldn't sit at the front of a streetcar, who were relegated to separate and degrading facilities in every public space. Should these men shoulder rifles and charge German machine gun nests? The debate was fierce and real and not easily resolved. But something else competed with that argument. A belief, or perhaps more accurately a hope, that military service might be the lever that finally moved the immovable object of American racism. That if black men served with distinction, not merely adequately, but with undeniable, documented, witnessed distinction, it would become impossible for white America to continue justifying the systematic degradation of black life. The Civil War had produced black soldiers who fought with extraordinary courage, and it hadn't ended discrimination. But maybe this war would be different. Maybe this time, the service would be so visible, so undeniable, so decorated that the argument would have to change. W.E.B. Du Bois, the towering intellectual of the era, made the argument plainly in The Crisis: close ranks, set aside grievances for the duration, serve with distinction, and hold America to account afterward. He was not naive about what he was asking. He was making a calculated bet on the long game. Many black Americans agreed with him. Others disagreed bitterly, arguing that service to a country that didn't serve you was a fool's bargain. The argument would continue for the entire duration of the war and well beyond it. But in Harlem and in cities and towns across the country, black men began enlisting. At the 15th New York Infantry, the response was overwhelming. Picture the armory on 132nd Street where the regiment drilled. It wasn't grand, armories rarely are, but it had the feel of something serious. Men lined the walls waiting for their chance to sign papers, men of every description that Harlem could produce. There were porters who had worked the Pullman cars, developing the extraordinary ability to remain composed and courteous no matter what was said to them. There were musicians who played jazz and ragtime in the clubs that were making Harlem's nightlife famous. There were college men, recent graduates of Howard and Morehouse, who understood military history and could read maps and speak in full sentences about tactics. There were laborers, men with forearms like cable, who had been moving iron and hauling crates their entire lives and were not afraid of hard work or hard conditions. There were young men barely old enough to shave who had been dreaming of adventure, and older men who had complicated feelings about the whole enterprise, but were coming anyway because their neighbors were coming. They came with the particular combination of eagerness and wariness that characterized black life in America at that moment. Eager for the chance to prove something, wary of what proving it might actually cost. Among them was Henry Johnson. He was a small man, slight in build, working as a railroad porter out of Albany, New York. You would not have looked at Henry Johnson and thought, soldier. He didn't have the bearing of a man who had been near violence. He had the practiced invisibility of a man who served, who moved through white spaces, bringing things and taking things, and remaining carefully unremarkable. But Henry Johnson had signed up, and something in the way he carried himself in the armory suggested he was not planning to be unremarkable here. There was also Horace Pippin, who would later become a celebrated painter, carrying in the imagery of the trenches that he would spend years processing on canvas. There were men whose names history has mostly lost, who arrived with their whole lives folded into a small bag, ready to bet everything on a country that hadn't particularly deserved that bet. Their official music director would become one of the most important figures in the regiment's story, Lieutenant James Reese Europe, a black musician who was already famous in Harlem for organizing the Clef Club Orchestra and bringing black musical innovation to Carnegie Hall. Europe believed that music wasn't decoration, it was identity, that the sound the regiment carried with it would be as much a weapon as any rifle. He would be proven right in ways nobody could have anticipated. The regiment's commander, Colonel William Hayward, knew what he had. He had watched these men drill through the winter months in inadequate facilities with inadequate equipment, and he had seen the determination underneath the frustration. He had a habit of walking through the armory at odd hours, stopping to talk with individual soldiers, learning their names and where they were from and what they did before the war. This was not simply good management. It was Hayward telling his men, in the most direct way available to him, that he saw them, that he was going to fight for them. that he was going to get them to the front. The prejudice he was fighting against was not subtle or deniable. It was written into military policy, stated openly in official reports, and defended by generals who should have known better. The prevailing view in the American Expeditionary Forces was that black soldiers could serve in labor capacities, hauling, digging, loading, building, but were fundamentally unsuited to combat. This view was presented not as prejudice, but as practical military assessment. The reports that supported it were selective, biased, and in many cases simply fabricated, but they circulated at the highest levels of command with the authority of fact. The specific mechanism of this exclusion was simple. Black combat units would not be permitted to fight alongside white American units. The fear, and it was stated explicitly in internal memoranda, was that combat service would give black soldiers ideas about equality that would be dangerous to manage back home. The military was not fighting two wars, one against Germany and one against the aspirations of its own black citizens. It was fighting only one war, and it intended to win it, and keeping the social order of the American South intact was part of what winning meant to many of the white officers in command. Hayward understood this. He didn't necessarily challenge it directly. He was operating within the system, not dismantling it. But he found a way around it, or rather, the military system itself eventually created the opening he needed, because the French army was watching, and the French had a completely different set of concerns. But that moment was still months away when the regiment received its orders in the fall of 1917. They were shipping out, going to France. The war they had trained for was finally, actually going to happen. The men packed their equipment and wrote letters home. Some of those letters were matter of fact, the writing of men who had prepared themselves and were ready. Others were more searching, full of the kind of sentiment that people express when they're not certain they'll have another chance to express it. Men told their mothers they loved them. They told their wives to take care of the children. They told their fathers they would make them proud. Henry Johnson reportedly sent a brief note to his wife, Edna, that was characteristically understated. He was going. He would be careful. He would be back. The crossing of the Atlantic in December 1917 was dangerous in ways beyond the obvious. German submarines had been hunting Allied shipping for 3 years, developing their tactics and their technology into something genuinely terrifying. Transport ships traveled in convoys when possible, with destroyers running protective patterns around them, but the threat was real and present. The men of the 369th knew this. They had read the newspapers. They understood that some ships didn't make it. They crossed anyway, packed into troop transports in the gray December Atlantic, the water steel-colored and violent. Men who had never been further from Harlem than New Jersey stood at railings and watched the ocean with expressions that ranged from awe to carefully disguised fear. The jazz musicians played in the holds at night because James Reese Europe believed that music was what kept men human when circumstances threatened to reduce them to something less, and because the men needed it. The music that rose from those ship holds, syncopated, rhythmic, alive in ways that European classical music wasn't, would become one of the unexpected gifts the regiment gave to France. But they didn't know that yet. They were still just cold and anxious and crossing a submarine-infested ocean toward a war that had already killed millions. When the troop ships finally moved into the harbor at Brest on the western coast of France in January 1918, the men crowded the decks to see land. France, another country, another world. The port city was gray and battered and busy, thick with military traffic of every kind. French soldiers moved in their distinctive blue-gray uniforms. British Tommies with their flat caps passed in formation. There were colonial troops from across the French Empire, Senegalese soldiers, Moroccan soldiers, Algerians, men of color fighting under the French flag with full military status, a sight that struck the men of the 369th with complicated force. Here in France, men who looked somewhat like them were treated as soldiers, not as labor, not as a problem to be managed, as soldiers. That observation would prove both inspiring and painful in the weeks that followed, because the American military was not yet prepared to make the same accommodation. the 369th disembarked and was almost immediately assigned to labor duties at the port. Shovels instead of rifles, crates instead of strategy. They unloaded ships and built roads and were looked at by white American units with the same dismissive contempt that had followed them across the ocean. The frustration was a physical thing. These men had trained, they had drilled and studied and prepared. They had crossed the Atlantic at risk of their lives. They had left their families and their neighborhoods and their futures behind. And now they were handing ammunition boxes from the hold of a ship to a dock that smelled like fish and diesel. At night, in their barracks, the conversations were quiet but intense. How long would this last? Would they ever get their chance? Was the whole thing, the enlistment, the training, the crossing, going to end with them going home having proven nothing, except that they were willing to do the work that nobody else wanted? Colonel Hayward was asking the same questions, but in different rooms, with different authority. He knew that the assignment to labor duty was not the end. He knew the French army was short of men. He had been in communication with French commanders who were interested in the regiment, interested in a way that the American High Command was not. And he was preparing to do something that the American military establishment would never entirely forgive him for. He was preparing to offer his regiment to the French. In the spring of 1918, with the German offensive building and the Allied lines under pressure they hadn't experienced since 1914, the mathematics of the Western Front made the conversation possible. The French needed bodies in the trenches. The American High Command needed to maintain the fiction that its forces were operating as an independent army, not being fed piecemeal into French and British formations. There were intense negotiations between General Pershing and the French command about how American troops would be deployed, and under whose authority. In the middle of this bureaucratic standoff, Hayward made his move. The 369th Infantry Regiment would be attached to the French Fourth Army. They would fight under the French flag. They would follow French orders. They would be issued French weapons, the Liebel rifle, the Chauchat automatic rifle, the particular tools of the French soldier. They would eat French rations, which were different from American rations in ways that the men would find partly interesting and partly challenging. They would be paid on the French military pay scale, and they would be treated, to the extent that the French army was capable of it, as soldiers. The American High Command's response to this arrangement was quiet fury. They could not stop it. The logic of Allied cooperation made that difficult. But they could make their displeasure known, and they could issue documents. Documents instructing the French military not to socialize with the black American soldiers, not to commend them publicly in ways that might embarrass white American soldiers, not to treat them as equals. The document, which historians have called the Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops, was an extraordinary artifact of institutional racism, a formal attempt to export Jim Crow to France. The French, to their considerable credit, largely ignored it. What they saw instead were men who wanted to fight, men who had been waiting for this moment with a patience that had cost them something real, men who, when handed French rifles and told they were going to the front, stood straighter and breathed differently, as if some weight they had been carrying had finally been acknowledged to exist. The 369th marched out of their labor assignments and toward the front lines of France. And the war they were about to fight, the 191 days in the trenches, was about to begin. But neither the Germans waiting for them in those opposing trenches, nor the American commanders watching from a comfortable distance, nor even the French officers preparing to deploy them, truly understood what they were about to see. They were about to see what happens when men who have been told their entire lives that they are less discover a context in which they can prove, conclusively and publicly, that every word of that judgment was a lie. The forests and fields of northeastern France were about to hear something they hadn't heard before. Not the sound of black soldiers failing, not the sound of surrender or retreat, or the particular chaos of men who don't know what they're doing under fire. The forests of France were about to hear the sound of men who had been waiting their entire lives for exactly this. The sector they were given was called the Argonne. Say that word slowly and let it settle. The Argonne. It was a stretch of the Western Front in northeastern France, where the forest pressed close on both sides of the trench lines. Old-growth beech and oak that had survived centuries of French history before the war arrived and turned them into something sinister. The trees were still standing in places, but they had been shattered by artillery, half their crowns blown away, trunks scarred by shrapnel, roots undermined by the constant digging of men who needed to put ground between themselves and the guns. What remained was not a forest so much as a dark maze of broken things, full of shadows and unexpected sounds, and the particular silence that falls when everyone within a kilometer is holding their breath. The French had chosen this sector deliberately. It was active, but not catastrophic, a stretch of front where experienced troops could hold the line, and green troops could be blooded without being immediately destroyed. The French commanders who made the assignment were not being cruel. They were being pragmatic. They needed to know what the 369th could do before they committed them to something larger. And they needed men in the Argonne, because the Argonne was the kind of place that ate soldiers quietly, a wound that never fully closed. The regiment moved up to the front in stages, as armies always do, the reality of war arriving in increments rather than all at once. First came the distant sound of artillery, a low rumbling that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears, like standing next to a bass drum being struck continuously a mile away. Then came the smell. The particular smell of the Western Front that no account of the war fails to mention, because it was impossible to ignore. Mud and rot and something chemical from the gas attacks, cordite from the shells, the sweet, sickening edge of things that had been alive and were no longer. Men who had grown up in cities, who knew the smells of tenements and subway tunnels and slaughterhouses, found themselves encountering something that had no reference point in their previous experience. Then came the trenches themselves. A trench in 1918 was not a simple ditch. It was an engineering achievement of a particularly dark kind. The main trench, the firing trench, was typically 6 to 8 feet deep, narrow enough that 2 men had to turn sideways to pass each other. The walls were reinforced with sandbags, timber, corrugated metal sheeting, whatever was available. Firing steps ran along the forward wall, raised platforms where men could stand to peer over the parapet at no man's land. Every dozen yards or so, the trench angled sharply. These were called traverses, and their purpose was to limit the damage from a shell landing directly in the trench line, containing the blast and shrapnel to a single bay, rather than killing everyone in a straight run. Behind the firing trench were communication trenches, running at angles back toward the support lines and the reserve positions. These were the highways of the underground world, the routes along which everything moved, men rotating in and out, ammunition going forward, food going forward, the wounded going backward. Navigating them at night was disorienting even for experienced soldiers, because every communication trench looked like every other one in the dark, and a wrong turn could take you toward the enemy, rather than away. The men of the 369th entered this world and tried to absorb it. Their French advisors walked them through the basic protocols. Never raise your head above the parapet in daylight. German snipers were patient men with good rifles and excellent optics, and they killed carelessly, the way you might swat a fly, without particular malice and without hesitation. Sleep in shifts. Eat when you can. Keep your rifle clean, because a jammed weapon in a trench raid was a death sentence. Learn the sound difference between incoming artillery and outgoing, because the distinction mattered, and your body needed to make it automatically, without having to think. The French soldiers who shared the sector with the 369th in those early weeks were curious about their new allies in the way that people are curious about strangers who arrive in a familiar place. Some were genuinely welcoming. France had a long relationship with black populations from its colonial empire, and racial prejudice, while certainly present, did not manifest in the same rigid, systematic way it did in America. French soldiers shared rations, taught the Americans card games, attempted communication across the language barrier with the kind of inventive gesture and facial expression diplomacy that soldiers have always used. James Reese Europe, the regiment's bandmaster and now one of its officers, had studied French and could bridge the gap in both directions. He moved between the French and American soldiers with an ease that came from a lifetime of navigating different worlds. The black world of Harlem, the white world of Carnegie Hall, the complicated borderlands in between. He noticed things. He noticed that the French soldiers treated the men of the 369th differently from how white American soldiers had treated them. Not with exaggerated respect or the particular awkwardness of men trying to perform equality, just with the ordinary lack of attention that soldiers give to other soldiers, the kind of indifference that is actually a form of acceptance. He wrote about it in letters home. The difference in how it felt to be seen as a soldier rather than as a symbol of a problem. But the trench sector was not going to allow the men of the 369th much time for philosophical reflection. The Argonne in the spring of 1918 was alive with the particular violence of a front that both sides were actively trying to manage. Night raids were constant. Both German and Allied forces used them to gather intelligence, capturing prisoners who could be interrogated about unit movements, troop strength, planned operations, and to keep the enemy anxious and off balance. A force that had to worry about raiders in the dark every night was a force that was not sleeping well, not thinking clearly, not at its best. The 369th threw itself into patrol work with the kind of intensity that comes from having something to prove. Night patrols were the most dangerous work available on a quiet front, and the regiment volunteered for more of them than was strictly required. They moved through no man's land in small groups, sometimes just 2 or 3 men, learning the terrain between the lines by feel and by memory, memorizing the shell craters and the cut wire and the particular darkness of this particular patch of French countryside. No man's land was perhaps a quarter-mile wide in this sector. It sounds manageable until you are in it, lying flat in a shell crater, listening to the sounds around you with the specific focus of a man who understands that his life depends on accurately interpreting what he hears. The rats were everywhere, enormous, bold, indifferent to human presence, because they had been feeding on the Western Front since 1914 and had lost any instinctive wariness of people. They moved through no man's land at night with more comfort than the soldiers did, which said something about what the war had done to this landscape. The barbed wire was another world unto itself. It wasn't the simple farm wire of peacetime. It was military wire, thick and multiply-barbed, strung in overlapping belts that could be 20 or 30 feet deep, designed not just to stop infantry, but to tangle them, to hold them in place where machine guns and artillery could find them. Moving through wire in daylight was difficult. Moving through it in darkness, in silence, without the equipment specifically designed to cut it, required a patience and a physical tolerance for pain that not every soldier could sustain. The men of the 369th learned. They learned because they had to, and because they were determined to be not just adequate at this work, but genuinely good at it. Every successful patrol was a small victory in the larger argument they were making. Every quiet return to the trench with useful intelligence was a point in favor of the position that black soldiers could function under pressure. The weight of that argument pressed on every man every time he went out. It was on the night of May 15th, 1918, that the argument was made so loudly that it could never really be dismissed again. Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts were on sentry duty at a listening post, a forward position in no man's land, closer to the German lines than to the Allied ones, designed to give early warning of enemy activity. Listening posts were manned by pairs of soldiers precisely because the position was so dangerous. 2 men could cover each other, could alert the main trench if something was happening, could potentially fight their way back if discovered. They were uncomfortable positions, exposed positions, positions that required the men manning them to remain absolutely still and absolutely quiet for hours at a time. Johnson and Roberts had been out there for several hours when Johnson heard something. What he heard was the sound of wire being cut. This sound, the quiet, methodical snipping of military wire being worked through in sections, was one of the sounds patrol leaders specifically trained their men to recognize. It meant a German raiding party was approaching. It meant they were already committed to their approach route, which meant they were closer than the first sound of cutting would suggest, because the cutting began at the outer edge of the wire and worked inward. Johnson woke Roberts quietly and sent him with a grenade back toward the main trench. Standard procedure, alerting the trench to the raid. Then, Johnson did something that was not precisely standard procedure. He stayed. What emerged from the darkness was a German raiding party estimated at somewhere between 20 and 36 men, depending on which account you consult. The official French investigation settled on approximately 24. They were experienced soldiers, operating in disciplined silence, moving through the wire with the confidence of men who had done this before. They found Henry Johnson. The fight that followed lasted only a few minutes, but those minutes produced something that France, and eventually history, would not forget. Johnson threw grenades first, into the group before they could react. Then, his rifle jammed, a problem with the Liebel in wet conditions that was unfortunately not uncommon, and he swung it like a club, using it as a bludgeon against men who outnumbered him so severely that the rational calculation was immediate surrender or immediate death. Neither option appears to have occurred to him as particularly acceptable. Roberts had been pulled from the darkness by two German soldiers. They had him, had grabbed him, and were dragging him toward their lines. Taking prisoners was the point of most raids. A prisoner could be interrogated. Roberts was small and already wounded, and in the dark and confusion he had been seized. Johnson went after them. With a bolo knife, the short, heavy-bladed tool that soldiers carried for utility work, Johnson attacked the men who had Roberts. He was fighting multiple opponents simultaneously, wounded himself by this point, bleeding from bullet wounds and shrapnel, and he fought his way to Roberts, drove off the men holding him, and continued fighting until the German raiding party withdrew. When it was over, and the French came forward to assess what had happened, they found a listening post with evidence of a sustained and violent engagement. They found Henry Johnson with 21 wounds, some from bullets, some from bayonets, some from the close quarters fighting that had happened in the dark. They found Needham Roberts alive, wounded but alive, the man he had gone back to rescue. They found no American dead. And they found evidence that the German raiding party had withdrawn in disorder, leaving equipment behind. Equipment including what appeared to be blood trails indicating casualties. The French press got hold of the story. The name that appeared in the newspapers was chosen by a journalist who was trying to capture in a phrase what this small man from Albany, New York had done in the dark. Black Death. Other accounts used different language, but the story spread through the French press with the velocity of something the public needed. A story of extraordinary courage at a moment when courage was required. The regiment got its nickname from a different source. It came from the Germans. Specifically, it came from the German soldiers in the opposing trenches who began encountering the night patrols of the 369th with a frequency and a ferocity that made an impression. The German term that passed through their lines and eventually reached Allied intelligence was something along the lines of Höllenkämpfer, Hellfighters. Fighting men from hell, or fighting men with hell in them, depending on how you chose to translate the concept. The name attached itself to the regiment and has never let go. The Harlem Hellfighters. It sounds like something from a story, which is perhaps why it lasted, but it came from enemies, which is the most credible possible source. Your own army will name you things for administrative reasons. Your friends will name you things out of affection. But when your enemies name you something, they're expressing a judgment that costs them something to express. The Germans named the 369th Hellfighters because that was the most accurate description available to them. It was a name earned in blood and darkness, and the particular terror of men who fought with a fury that the opposing soldiers had not expected and could not easily explain. Henry Johnson received the Croix de Guerre, the French military's highest battlefield decoration, with a gold palm, the most distinguished version of the award, given only for extraordinary individual acts of valor. The ceremony was conducted by French officers who had read the reports and understood what they were recognizing. Johnson stood in his uniform, 21 wounds healing in his body, and received from the French military the honor that the American military had not offered and would not offer for nearly a century more. Needham Roberts received the Croix de Guerre as well. The regiment noticed. The French soldiers in adjacent sectors noticed. The story moved through the Allied lines the way important stories always do, Informally, but quickly, men telling other men what they had heard, the details accumulating and sometimes expanding, but the core of the story remaining constant. 2 men, against 24, in the dark, and the 2 men were from Harlem. Back in New York, the black press had already been covering the regiment with a devotion that the white press wasn't matching. The New York Age, the Chicago Defender. The Crisis. These publications understood what the 369th represented in a way that white American newspapers didn't or wouldn't. They printed what they could learn, celebrated what was verifiable, and worked to keep the story in front of black communities across the country that needed to hear it. The Johnson and Roberts story, when it arrived, hit those communities like electricity. Here was proof. Not argument, not aspiration, not the kind of dignified insistence on potential that Du Bois had been making in the pages of The Crisis. Proof. Documented, decorated, witnessed proof that the men they had sent to France were fighting with a courage that the French military had officially recognized with its highest honor. The argument had been made. It had been made at night, in no man's land, against 24 opponents, with 21 wounds and a bolo knife. No one could look at what Henry Johnson had done and honestly invoke the word cowardice. No one could read the French reports and maintain with a straight face that these men were unsuited for combat. Some people tried anyway. The capacity of prejudice to survive evidence is one of the most dispiriting features of human psychology, and 1918 was not a moment of great psychological clarity in America. White newspapers either ignored the story or minimized it. Official American military reports gave it sparse attention. The machinery of dismissal continued to operate even in the face of the croix de guerre. But the story was now alive in the world, and living things are harder to kill than arguments. Inside the regiment, the effect of the Johnson-Roberts fight was harder to precisely measure, but impossible to miss. Men who had spent months in labor duty, months being told with every assignment that they were not trusted to fight, had now seen, had heard directly from their comrades who had been there, what men from their regiment could do. The specifics spread through every company. The 21 wounds, the bolo knife, the German soldiers leaving their equipment behind as they retreated. The names of the men they knew, men they had drilled with in the armory on 132nd Street, men from neighborhoods they recognized. It did something to the regiment that training alone cannot do. It gave them a story about themselves, and the story they now had was, "We are men who do not break." Colonel Hayward wrote to the War Department with something approaching triumph in his tone. His men had fought. His men had been decorated by France for extraordinary valor. His men were, by any measurable standard, performing at the level of the finest soldiers on the Western Front. He wanted recognition. He wanted proper equipment. He wanted his regiment treated as the combat unit it had proven itself to be. The War Department's response was measured and not particularly generous, but it could not be entirely dismissive either. The French decoration was a public fact. Johnson's name was in French newspapers. Ignoring it completely would have required a particular kind of official boldness that the bureaucracy wasn't quite prepared for. What came instead was something more typical of how institutions respond to uncomfortable evidence. The 369th was acknowledged. The courage of its soldiers was noted grudgingly in language that managed to compliment them while somehow framing the compliment as faint surprise that such things were possible. And then the regiment was left in the Argonne to continue doing the work that had produced the evidence in the first place, with no particular change in their official status. That was fine. The regiment had work to do, because the spring of 1918 was bringing a crisis to the Western Front that dwarfed any question of regimental politics or racial prejudice. Germany had launched Operation Michael in March, the massive offensive that had punched through British lines and come frighteningly close to splitting the Allied armies. That offensive had been stopped, barely, but the German high command was not finished. New offensives were being planned, new sectors targeted, new pressure applied to lines that were already bent nearly to breaking. The French high command was reorganizing, shifting forces, trying to plug gaps and reinforce sectors before the next German push. In this reorganization, the 369th was not forgotten. The French had seen what the regiment could do. They had the reports. They had the decorations. And they needed men who could hold ground. The regiment was moved to sectors where the fighting was heavier, the stakes higher, the requirement for disciplined, experienced soldiers more acute. With each movement forward, the men of the 369th went deeper into the war that France was fighting, further from the protective distance of labor duty and into the daily reality of what the Western Front demanded from everyone it touched. They were becoming, through accumulated experience and the specific education that only combat provides, exactly what the American military had told them they could never be. They were becoming an elite regiment. The soldiers felt it in ways that were difficult to articulate, but real. The way they moved through the communication trenches had changed. The way they slept, the ability to sleep briefly and lightly, and come awake instantly at a sound, had changed. The way they looked at no man's land had changed. What had been an alien and terrifying landscape had become, if not familiar, at least navigable. They knew where the wire was thickest. They knew which shell craters offered cover and which were deceptively shallow. They knew how sound moved differently at different times of night, what the wind direction meant for gas risk, how to read the rhythm of German artillery patterns to predict when a barrage would lift. This knowledge was bought at cost, as it always is. Men had been wounded. Some had been killed. Every death produced a particular grief in a unit this size. Not the abstract statistics of a massive army, but the loss of a specific man. A man with a name and a personality and habits that his comrades had learned to expect and now had to adjust to not having. The losses tightened some bonds and frayed others. The weight of being responsible for each other in conditions where the margin for error was essentially zero produced both solidarity and tension, sometimes in the same men within the same hour. James Reese Europe kept the music going. This is worth dwelling on because it was not peripheral to the regiment's identity. It was central to it. Europe organized performances whenever conditions allowed, not elaborate concerts, but the kind of spontaneous music making that soldiers have always used to maintain their humanity under pressure. Men gathered in dugouts and communication trenches and the courtyards of damaged farmhouses, and Europe's musicians played, and something happened to the men who listened that pure military training cannot produce, and pure military discipline cannot sustain. The French soldiers who heard the regiment's music were affected in ways they struggled to describe. The rhythms were unlike anything in European military music. The jazz and ragtime idiom, syncopated, improvisational, driven by a relationship to groove and feel that classical training didn't teach, struck French soldiers as something both utterly foreign and immediately comprehensible. They couldn't name what they were hearing. They hadn't heard anything like it before, but they responded to it with the directness of people encountering something that bypasses the analytical mind and speaks to something more fundamental. The music spread. French soldiers began requesting performances. Officers arranged small concerts. European audiences were getting their first sustained exposure to American jazz, delivered by the 369th Infantry Regiment in the middle of a world war, and the experience was leaving an impression on French culture that would take decades to fully express itself. But that was for later. In the late spring of 1918, the regiment's primary business was still survival. The German offensives continued. The Aisne offensive in May pushed the lines south and created fresh crises that required fresh responses. The 369th held its sector. It patrolled. It raided. It lost men and replaced them and continued. And somewhere in the German command structure, intelligence officers were beginning to compile a picture of this American regiment that was causing them disproportionate difficulty in the Argonne sector. The reports that came back through German channels described the 369th in language that would have deeply satisfied Colonel Hayward and profoundly disturbed the American generals who had doubted these men from the beginning. The Germans were not dismissive. They were not contemptuous. They were, if the intelligence reports are read carefully, something approaching wary. These were not the men their officers had joked about over morning coffee. These were the Harlem Hellfighters, and they had 191 days left to prove exactly what that name meant. There is a document that exists in the German military archives, buried for years under the weight of a lost war and the bureaucratic sediment of a collapsed empire, that tells you everything you need to know about what the 369th Infantry Regiment had become by the summer of 1918. It is not a commendation. It is not a tribute. It was written by men who had every reason to minimize what they were describing, and no reason at all to exaggerate it. It is a formal warning issued by German military intelligence to their own frontline units, advising soldiers in the sectors adjacent to the 369th positions to exercise extreme caution when encountering this particular American regiment. The warning described the Hellfighters as exceptionally aggressive on patrol. It noted their willingness to engage at close quarters. It observed that their night operations were conducted with a skill and discipline that exceeded what the Germans had expected from American units, and specifically from these American units. The document used language that German military reports reserved for opponents who had earned genuine respect. The particular dry, precise vocabulary of professional soldiers acknowledging other professional soldiers. Think about what that document represents. The United States Army, in official correspondence, was still describing black soldiers as inherently unsuited for combat as recently as early 1918. And here, from the enemy, from men whose professional interest lay entirely in accurate assessment rather than political comfort, was a formal declaration that the 369th was something to be feared. The Germans had stopped laughing. But the summer of 1918 that produced this document was not a season of easy triumphs. It was a season of grinding, continuous, remorseless effort that tested every man in the regiment against the full weight of what the Western Front could deliver. 191 days is an abstraction until you try to hold it in your mind as lived experience. Not 191 days of occasional excitement punctuated by rest and relief. 191 consecutive days of frontline deployment, without the rotation out of the trenches that every other American regiment received as a matter of standard military practice. Imagine what that means in the body. The constant sleep deprivation, never fully resting, always alert, the sound of incoming shells penetrating even the deepest exhaustion and bringing you upright before your conscious mind has fully engaged. The way food loses its taste after weeks of the same rations, eaten in the same posture, in the same gray light. The progressive deterioration of boots and uniforms against the moisture of the trenches, so that men were fighting in equipment that was slowly failing them. The smell of themselves and each other that became, after enough weeks, simply the smell of the world, noticed only when something cut through it. A letter from home that someone had pressed against perfume, a ration of tobacco, the particular sharp scent of a summer rainstorm over the shattered forest. The physical conditions of the Western Front in 1918 were in some ways better than the catastrophic early years of the war, when the trench systems were improvised and the medical understanding of conditions like trench foot was still developing. By 1918, commanders at least knew that standing in water for extended periods destroyed feet and tried to rotate men through dry positions when such positions existed. The 369th did not receive the benefit of rotation. They stood where they stood. They endured what the Argonne gave them, which was considerable. What sustained men in conditions like these was not abstract patriotism or ideological commitment. Those things matter in recruitment halls and political speeches, but in the third month of continuous frontline service, what actually keeps men functional is much more immediate. It is the man next to you. It is the specific knowledge that the person sharing your dugout will be awake when you need him to be awake, will do what he said he would do, will not leave you when it gets bad. The 369th had built these bonds during the long months of frustrated waiting in labor assignments, during the crossing of the Atlantic, during the early patrol work in the Argonne. By the summer of 1918, those bonds were structural. They were holding the regiment together the way the timber and sandbag revetments held the trench walls together, through accumulated layers of mutual experience and mutual trust. The sergeant became the organizing unit of this world. Not the colonel, not the general, not the distant figures of command whose decisions shaped the regiment's movements, but whose presence in any individual trench was rare and ceremonial. The sergeant was the man who knew which of his soldiers was holding up and which was beginning to crack, who needed to be pushed, and who needed to be given a task and left alone, who had a letter from home that had disturbed him and needed a conversation before going out on patrol, and who had simply gotten better at this and needed to know that someone had noticed. Among the sergeants and junior officers of the 369th, there were men who had developed this knowledge to a degree that the circumstances demanded. Men who had come from the railroad porters and the jazz clubs and the college classrooms of Black America and found in the specific crucible of the Western Front an unexpected vocation. Leadership under pressure is not the same skill as leadership under normal conditions, and the men who had it were not always the men who had seemed destined for it back in Harlem. The war had a way of redistributing that quality in ways that surprised everyone, including the men themselves. The raids continued through June and into July. The regiment had by now developed a reputation in the French Fourth Army that made their assignment to difficult sectors almost inevitable. Commanders kept deploying them where the situation was most challenging, which was both a tribute to what they had demonstrated and an additional burden placed on men who were already carrying more than any regiment should carry without relief. The French called on them, the French trusted them, and so they went, again and again, into the sectors that needed them most. The German response to this pattern was the formal intelligence warning that described the Hellfighters in terms of professional wariness. But it was also operational. The Germans began targeting the 369th's positions with increased artillery attention, attempting to degrade through firepower what they were having difficulty matching through patrol work. Artillery barrages fell on the regiment's trench sectors with a regularity that told the men they were being specifically targeted, which was, in the peculiar logic of the Western Front, something approaching a compliment. You did not dedicate artillery resources to a unit you considered unimportant. Men died in these barrages. They died in the particular way artillery kills: sudden, total, without the individual drama of a duel or a charge, just the sound of a shell arriving, and then an absence where a person had been. This was perhaps the hardest thing for soldiers on the Western Front to absorb psychologically. Not the personal violence of close combat, but the impersonal violence of artillery. The way it made each man feel simultaneously essential, because his unit needed him, and entirely replaceable, because the gun that killed him did not know his name, and would not remember the moment. The regiment absorbed these losses and kept its line, kept its patrols going, kept its watch at the listening posts. There was not an alternative. The French needed the sector held, and the 369th was the regiment holding it. Inside this sustained pressure, individual stories accumulated. Not the grand narrative stories of famous engagements, but the smaller stories that are the actual texture of a long campaign. The man who developed such a feel for the timing of German artillery patterns that he became something of an informal oracle for his section, able to read the rhythm of incoming fire in ways that saved lives in the sections around him. The soldier who kept a pocket-sized Bible that had been given to him by his mother and read from it every morning without fail, regardless of conditions, not visibly devotional about it, just reading, quietly, as a private ritual that apparently helped him maintain something essential about himself. The two men who discovered they had grown up within blocks of each other in Harlem without ever meeting, and who now shared a dugout in France and became, in the way that war compresses human experience, something closer than brothers. These stories were not written down at the time. They survived in memory, passed through oral tradition, occasionally captured in letters or in the accounts that veterans gave years later when journalists or historians found them and asked them to go back. The fragmentation of the historical record around the 369th is itself a story about who gets remembered and how, a story that we will return to. But the fragments that survive are sufficient to understand that the regiment was not a military abstraction. It was men. Specific men with specific histories and specific fears and specific reasons for continuing to do what they were doing in conditions that made continuing extremely difficult. James Reese Europe was one of the men whose story survived in greater detail than most, partly because he was already famous before the war, and partly because the music he made in France was noticed and documented in ways that the daily experience of ordinary soldiers was not. Europe was a complex figure. He had been born in Mobile, Alabama, and had come north to New York in his early 20s with a musician's ambition and an organizer's temperament. He had essentially invented the concept of a black musical union in New York, founding the Clef Club in 1910 as a professional organization for black musicians who were excluded from the white musicians' unions, and therefore from many of the better-paying performance opportunities in the city. The Clef Club Orchestra's concert at Carnegie Hall in 1912 had been a landmark event, not just a successful concert, but a demonstration that black musical performance belonged in the most prestigious venues in America, delivered on terms that the musicians themselves had defined. When Europe enlisted, he brought to the military the same organizing intelligence that had built the Clef Club. He understood that music was not separate from the regiment's identity. It was a medium through which the regiment expressed itself, maintained itself, made itself understood by people who didn't speak its language. He recruited musicians the way other officers recruited fighters, with attention to quality and complementarity, looking for men whose individual abilities would combine into something larger than any of them alone. The regimental band he built was extraordinary by any measure. It contained musicians who were, in some cases, the finest players of their instruments working in America at that time. Men who had played professionally in clubs and theaters, who had developed their craft to a level of technical excellence that formal training alone doesn't produce. Europe drilled them with the same seriousness that Hayward drilled his infantry, demanding precision and discipline alongside creativity, understanding that the two things were not in tension, but mutually dependent. When this band played for French audiences, the effect was something that contemporaries struggled to articulate in the vocabulary available to them. French musicians came to watch Europe's players with the specific attention of professionals encountering something they didn't understand, but immediately recognized as important. They observed the techniques, watched the embouchure and the fingerwork, tried to determine what was being done differently that produced sounds they hadn't heard before. What they were witnessing, though they didn't yet have the cultural framework to fully name it, was the emergence of jazz as a music that would reshape the Western world's musical landscape over the following decades. Europe himself was not unaware of what he was doing. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent his professional life navigating the intersection of black culture and white institutions, that every performance was also an argument about the sophistication of black creative life, an argument about the cultural contributions that black Americans were making to the country that degraded them, an argument that was being made in the most direct possible medium. Not words, not policy papers, not editorials in the crisis, but sound. Immediate, undeniable, physically compelling sound that reached French audiences who had no particular political position on American race relations and simply responded to what they heard. The French responded enormously. Crowds gathered for the regiment's performances with a warmth that the soldiers had not experienced in America, a warmth free of the particular condescension that white American liberalism sometimes dressed as acceptance. French audiences weren't congratulating themselves for enjoying black music. They were just enjoying it. The distinction mattered more than it might seem. There is an account, probably somewhat embellished in the retelling as accounts from this era often are, of a French bandmaster who approached Europe after a performance and asked with genuine professional curiosity what the musicians were doing with their instruments to produce those particular sounds. Europe reportedly demonstrated, showing that the technique was standard, that the instruments were standard, that what was different was the musical conception, the approach to rhythm, the relationship between ensemble and improvisation, the feel that the players brought to every note. The French bandmaster allegedly went away both satisfied and somewhat overwhelmed by the implication that what he had heard was not a trick or an anomaly, but a fundamentally different way of organizing musical sound. Jazz was arriving in Europe, and the Harlem Hellfighters were the delivery mechanism, but the music never made the regiment forget what it was there for. The band played in the evenings when conditions allowed. In the mornings, the infantry went back to the war. Europe himself participated in combat operations, carrying a weapon and going out on patrol, refusing the relative safety that his role as a musician and officer might have permitted him to claim. He was wounded during one engagement, a gas attack that affected his lungs and required medical treatment. He recovered and returned. The regiment was not a place where men preserved themselves at the expense of their comrades, and Europe was too embedded in its culture to behave differently from anyone else. The summer deepened. The German offensives that had threatened to break the Allied lines in the spring had been stopped, and the initiative was beginning to shift. American forces were arriving in France in greater numbers, not the trickle of early 1918, but a genuine flood of fresh soldiers, untouched by 3 years of attrition, bringing with them the particular energy of men who hadn't yet been ground down. The German High Command could see what was happening and understood that their window for winning the war was closing. What followed was a series of increasingly desperate German efforts to achieve something decisive before the American numbers made the arithmetic impossible. The 369th was in the middle of all of it. The French Fourth Army, to which they were attached, was a principal force in the Allied counteroffensives that began in the summer and would not stop until November. The regiment fought in conditions that shifted from the grinding static warfare of the trenches to something more mobile, more fluid, more unpredictable, the kind of fighting that required different skills and different thinking, where the trench maps that men had memorized were suddenly obsolete because the lines were moving. In this mobile warfare, the regiment performed with the same quality that had defined its trench work, perhaps more visibly, because the results of mobile operations are more immediately apparent than the results of holding a static sector. Ground taken, objectives secured, positions consolidated. The French officers who commanded the 369th's operations at the tactical level wrote reports that used words like admirable and irreproachable when describing the regiment's conduct. These were not words that French military reporting deployed casually. The casualties accumulated with the fighting. By the late summer, the regiment had lost men enough to feel the gaps, places in its structure where men had been and now were not. Replacements arrived, and the veterans absorbed them with the pragmatic efficiency of a unit that had learned to do this, integrating new soldiers quickly because the alternative was a unit that kept breaking its rhythm to mourn. This is not callousness. It is one of the necessary adaptations that sustained combat produces. The ability to hold grief alongside function, to mourn without stopping, because the work requires continuing. Among the wounded was Henry Johnson, the man who had fought 24 Germans with a bolo knife and 21 wounds, had continued fighting in the months after his famous night in no man's land, because that was what the regiment did, and he was part of the regiment. He was eventually evacuated with wounds that had accumulated beyond what the human body can simply work through. He left France without ceremony. There was no ceremony available for men leaving the front lines, only the quiet transaction of a wounded soldier being moved backward through the medical chain. His departure left a specific kind of absence in the regiment. He had become, in the months since the May raid, something more than a soldier. He was the living proof of the argument they were all making, the man whose name the French newspapers had printed and whose decorations the French army had bestowed, and whose story the black press back home was still telling. When he was gone from the trenches, the story he represented remained, carried forward by every man who had been there and remembered. The regiment talked about him the way units talk about their legends. Not constantly, not sentimentally, but with the particular economy of men who know the story, can be told in a few words, and rely on the listener to fill in what the words don't say. Johnson, 21 wounds, bolo knife. They went away. That was enough. The summer became fall. The forests of the Argonne, which had been in full leaf when the regiment arrived, began to change color, the beech trees going golden and the oaks to bronze, a beauty that seemed almost inappropriate given what was happening among their roots and along their shattered trunks. The men noticed it anyway. Soldiers always notice beauty in contrast to ugliness, perhaps more intensely than people in ordinary circumstances, because the contrast is more extreme. The autumn light in the forest came at a particular angle in the afternoon that turned the shattered landscape briefly golden, and men who had spent the day in the mud would stop, sometimes, to look at it. Letters home in this period sometimes mentioned the light, the trees, the strange beauty of a place that was also terrible. The letters were careful. Censorship was still active, but they had the quality of men trying to hold on to something human in conditions designed to strip humanity down. The music helped. The letters helped. The specific knowledge of the man next to you helped. Everything that connected these soldiers to their lives before the war and their hopes for lives after, it was a resource as real as ammunition or rations. In September, the massive Allied offensive began. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was the largest military operation in American history to that point, involving over 1 million American soldiers, coordinated with French and other Allied forces in an assault along a broad front designed to break the German lines and end the war before winter. The 369th was positioned in the French sector of this offensive, attached to the Fourth Army, and when the whistles blew and the orders came, they went forward with everyone else. The fighting in September and October was different from anything that had come before. Not the patient, grinding work of the trenches, but something faster and more violent, attacking fortified positions across ground that the Germans had prepared for defense over 4 years. Every village was a fortress. Every tree line concealed machine gun positions. Every crossroads had been pre-registered by German artillery, meaning the gunners knew the exact range and elevation needed to bring fire onto it at a moment's notice. The regiment attacked through this landscape with a ferocity that the French officers directing them would later describe in terms of simple admiration. They took objectives. They held ground. They pushed forward when units on their flanks were pinned down, maintaining the advance that the operation required, even when the cost of maintaining it was high. The discipline that Hayward had been building since the Armory days on 132nd Street, the discipline that the months of trench service had refined into something almost automatic, expressed itself in these offensive operations as units doing what needed to be done without being told to repeatedly, without breaking when the first assault failed, without losing cohesion in the chaos of mobile fighting. Through October, the fighting continued. The German lines were bending. Finally, under the combined pressure of the Allied offensive and the simple mathematical reality that Germany was running out of men and resources while the Allies, with American industry and American manpower now fully engaged, were not. The German High Command was negotiating for an armistice, even as their frontline soldiers continued to fight, which created a strange and bloody final month of the war in which men died for positions that would be abandoned in a matter of weeks by treaty. The 369th kept fighting. They had no way of knowing when it would end. Nobody at the front ever does, because the information about armistice negotiations exists at a level of command so far removed from the trench that it might as well be on another planet. What the men in the front lines knew was what they could see and hear. And what they could see and hear was still war. By the end of October, the regiment had been in continuous frontline service for roughly 170 days. The men knew this. They kept count, the way soldiers always keep count, of things that matter to their survival. Days served, days remaining, the arithmetic of endurance. They were not the same men who had boarded the transport ships in December 1917. The war had done to them what it does to everyone it touches, stripping away everything that is not essential and leaving behind something harder and more concentrated. They had lost the innocence of untested soldiers without losing the purpose that had brought them here. They were tired in a way that sleep alone cannot fix. And they were still fighting. The German warning that had circulated through the opposing lines described the Hellfighters accurately, but it could not capture this: the specific quality of men who have endured past the point where endurance was expected, who have kept going not because they were unaffected by what they were going through, but because stopping was something they had decided, collectively and individually, was not available to them. They were carrying more than themselves. They knew it. Every man in that regiment understood that he was fighting a battle that extended beyond the Argonne forest, beyond the Western Front, beyond the borders of France. The battle they were fighting in the trenches had a second dimension that the French soldiers alongside them were not required to fight. The battle to prove something to a country that was simultaneously asking for their sacrifice and denying their humanity. That weight does not make courage easier. If anything, it makes it heavier. Because the consequences of failure extend beyond the military into the personal and the political and the generational. These men were fighting not just for their own survival, but for the argument that their survival and their conduct would make. The argument that black men were capable of everything that the American military had insisted they were incapable of. The argument that the men who had said otherwise were wrong had always been wrong, and that this wrongness had cost something, in wasted potential, in denied opportunity, in the specific human cost of being told you are less than you are. That argument was being made in blood and endurance on the Western Front, and the men making it knew it, and the knowledge was both a burden and a fuel, the thing that kept the fire burning in conditions designed to extinguish everything. November was coming. The war was coming to its end, though nobody in the trenches knew exactly when. 191 days were nearly complete, and back in New York, in the neighborhoods of Harlem where these men had grown up, where their families still lived and worked and waited for letters, something was already building. A knowledge gathered from the black press, and from the letters that made it through, and from the networks of information that black communities had always maintained, because official channels couldn't be trusted to tell them what they needed to know. A knowledge that the men they had sent to France had done something that could not be undone and could not be forgotten. The Harlem Hellfighters were coming home, and Harlem was going to be ready for them. But before the homecoming, there was still November. There was still the armistice, and what happened immediately after it, and there were still questions about what exactly these men would return to, what the country that had sent them away was prepared to offer them when they came back. Those questions did not have comfortable answers in the fall of 1918. They would not have comfortable answers for a very long time. The 191 days ended in the mud and the autumn cold of northeastern France, with men who had started the year as the rejected, the doubted, the shunted aside and given shovels, and had become something that the finest armies in Europe had officially recorded as worth fearing. The German warning existed in the archives. The French decorations existed in the physical world, pinned to the chests of men who had earned them in ways that the medals themselves could only partially represent. The forests of France had heard the sound they came to make. What they would hear next was silence. The silence of November 11th, 1918, when the guns finally stopped. And in that silence, 191 days of noise and fire, and the specific music of a regiment that had refused to accept the limitations placed on it, echoed forward into everything that came after. The guns stopped at 11 o'clock in the morning on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, and the silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, so physically different from everything that had preceded it, that men who experienced it spent the rest of their lives struggling to describe what it felt like. 4 years of continuous industrial noise, artillery, machine guns, aircraft engines, the constant percussion of a war being fought with the full productive capacity of the modern world. And then nothing. Just the wind, just the sound of men breathing, just the particular quiet of a landscape that had forgotten what quiet was. In the French sector, where the 369th Infantry Regiment held its positions, the silence arrived the same way it arrived everywhere else along the Western Front, without drama, without announcement. One moment the guns were firing, and the next moment they were not, and the men in the trenches looked at each other with expressions that nobody had the vocabulary for, because the experience of that moment was genuinely new. Not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. Not joy, though joy was present too. Something more complicated. Something that required sitting with for a while before it resolved into anything nameable. The men of the 369th had been at the front for 191 days. Let every other number in this story settle behind that one for a moment. 191 consecutive days, 6.5 months. While other American regiments rotated in and out of the line, resting in rear areas, sleeping in beds, eating hot food, writing letters in warmth and relative safety. The 369th had stayed. The French Fourth Army had needed them and kept them, and they had stayed, because that was what the assignment required, and because these men had not come this far to ask for relief. When the silence came on November 11th, they had been awake for most of the night before. Not from combat specifically, but from the particular anticipatory alertness that spreads through frontline units when word filters through that something is about to change. Rumors of armistice negotiations had been circulating for weeks, gaining and losing credibility with each day's developments, and on the evening of November 10th, the rumors had a different quality, more specific, more detailed, more insistent. Men stayed awake half from anxiety and half from something harder to name, a reluctance to be asleep when whatever was coming finally arrived. When it came, some men wept. This is not recorded with the names attached, because soldiers rarely advertise such moments. But the accounts that survive from veterans of the 369th and other Western Front units describe the weeping as common and unashamed, which was itself remarkable in an era when military culture maintained strict expectations about masculine emotional expression. 4 years of war had apparently overwhelmed those expectations in men across multiple armies, and on November 11th, they expressed what they felt with a directness that peacetime rarely permits. Others were very quiet. Men sat in their dugouts, or on the fire step, or in the open air of a shell crater and did not speak, processing something that language was not quite equipped to handle. The war was over. They had survived it. Those two facts, placed next to each other, required a kind of reckoning that took time. The celebrations that erupted in Paris and London and New York that day were not the celebrations of the front. The front had its own response, more muted, more complicated, more aware of what the jubilation was built on. The men in the trenches knew what the cheering crowds in the cities didn't know, couldn't know, what had been paid for the right to celebrate. The specific weight of what 4 years of industrial warfare had cost in human terms was a knowledge that lived in the bodies of the men who had been there, and it made simple joy difficult, though not impossible. Colonel William Hayward moved through his regiment on the 11th, visiting positions, talking to his men. He had fought for these soldiers since before the war began, fought the bureaucracy, the prejudice, the institutional indifference that had tried to keep them away from the front they had earned. He had watched them become something extraordinary. He was not a man given to easy emotion, but the accounts of men who saw him that day describe someone who was visibly moved, who shook hands and did not let go immediately, who looked at his soldiers with an expression that combined pride with something more personal and harder to categorize. He had been right about them. He had said so from the beginning, in rooms where people laughed at him for saying it, and he had been right, and the proof was standing around him in the cold November air of northeastern France. 191 days of proof. The regiment began the process of demobilization slowly, as armies always do. The bureaucracy of ending a war is nearly as complex as the bureaucracy of fighting one, and the 369th was caught in the particular complexity of being an American unit attached to a French army, which meant the paperwork crossed multiple military systems in multiple languages with multiple sets of requirements. Hayward navigated this the same way he had navigated everything, with determination, political connections, and a refusal to accept outcomes that were unfair to his men. While the paperwork moved, the French army took the opportunity to make formal what it had been expressing informally throughout the regiment's service. In a ceremony that the surviving accounts describe as genuinely moving, the 369th Infantry Regiment was awarded the Croix de Guerre, not just individually to distinguished soldiers, but collectively as a unit. The entire regiment received France's highest military honor, a distinction that recognized not any single act of valor, but the sustained excellence of 191 days of continuous service. The ceremony was conducted with the full formality that the French military brings to such occasions. French officers who had commanded and observed the regiment spoke about what they had witnessed, the discipline, the courage, the tenacity, the way the regiment had held its positions and taken its objectives and conducted its patrols. They spoke about it in terms that the American military had consistently refused to use when describing black soldiers. They spoke about it as fact, as documented military reality, as the kind of performance that the French army recognized and honored because recognizing and honoring it was simply accurate. The men of the 369th stood in formation and received this recognition from an allied nation that had treated them as soldiers from the beginning, that had given them the opportunity their own country had denied them, that had watched what they did with that opportunity and responded with genuine respect. The emotions in that formation were complex. Gratitude, certainly. Pride, absolutely. And underneath both of those, something more difficult. The awareness that they would now have to return to a country that had not yet offered anything comparable, that had in fact spent the previous 2 years arguing that what was being celebrated here was impossible. The crossing home began in early 1919. The same Atlantic that had carried them to France in December 1917 now carried them back. But the men on the ships were not the same men who had made the eastward passage. They had been changed by what they had done and what they had seen, in ways that were still resolving themselves, that would continue resolving for the rest of their lives. They had fought in the largest and most terrible war in human history. They had done it with distinction that the French government had officially recognized. They had been decorated, praised, written about in French newspapers, appreciated by French civilians, who had treated them with a dignity that America had not offered. They were bringing all of that home with them, and they were about to discover what home had to say about it. The ship carrying the main body of the regiment entered New York Harbor in February 1919, and what happened next was something that the men had not been told to expect, and would spend years processing. New York turned out to meet them. Not officially, official America was not yet prepared for that, but the city itself, and specifically the black community of Harlem, came to the docks with the kind of welcome that people extend when they understand what they are welcoming home. Word had spread through the networks of the black press and the church communities and the neighborhood associations that had been following the regiment since its departure. People knew the name Hellfighters. They knew the name Henry Johnson. They had read the stories in the Crisis and the Chicago Defender and the New York Age. Stories that the white press had minimized or ignored, but that the black press had covered with the devotion of a community that understood what was at stake. They had been waiting for this. The parade came in February, down Fifth Avenue, and then up Lenox Avenue into Harlem, and it became one of the defining moments in the history of that neighborhood. Tens of thousands of people lined the route. The accounts describe crowds so dense that the police lost the ability to maintain the sidewalk boundaries they had established. The press of bodies simply overflowing into the street until the parade was moving through a canyon of people rather than past them. Flags were everywhere. People climbed lampposts and hung from fire escapes and pressed against each other in the cold February air for a sight of the regiment coming home. James Reese, Europe's band, led them. Think about that image. The musicians who had played jazz in the dugouts of the Argonne, who had introduced France to a sound it had never heard and would never forget, now playing that same music up the avenues of New York with the regiment marching behind them. The sound was different in the city streets than it had been in the forests of France. Louder, more reflective, bouncing off the brownstone faces of the buildings. But it was recognizably the same music, carrying the same energy, the same insistence, the same quality of refusing to be contained by the expectations of any audience. The crowd responded the way crowds respond to music that speaks to something they carry inside them. They cheered and wept and called out names. Old men who had fought in different wars stood at attention on the sidewalks with tears on their faces. Mothers who had spent 14 months terrified looked at the faces of soldiers who were not their sons and felt something release in their chests. Children who were too young to understand exactly what was happening absorbed through the sheer energy of the crowd that something important was occurring, that the men marching past them had done something that mattered. And the regiment marched through Harlem with the Croix de Guerre on their chests and the particular bearing of men who have been through something extreme and survived it intact. They had trained for this in the armory on 132nd Street, drilling until their feet bled in order to be ready for something. The battle they had trained for turned out to be unlike what any training could fully prepare them for. But the discipline that training had built was present in every man's posture as they moved through the streets where they had grown up. The joy of that day was real and enormous. It was also incomplete, in ways that the men in the parade understood even as the crowds cheered for them, because the America they were marching through had not changed while they were away. Jim Crow was still intact. The laws and customs and practices that degraded black life were still operating. In the South with their full formal brutality, and in the North with the informal but equally effective mechanisms of segregation and exclusion that northern cities had developed. The war had not changed any of that. In fact, in some respects, the immediate post-war period would make things worse before it made them better. The year 1919 is known to historians by a phrase that captures its particular horror with appropriate concision: the Red Summer. It was called Red for Blood, the blood of black Americans killed in a wave of racial violence that swept through the country in the months following the armistice. In city after city, white mobs attacked black communities with a ferocity that was partly about economic competition, partly about the assertion of racial hierarchy in a moment when black veterans were returning with new confidence and new expectations, and partly about the simple, ugly persistence of hatred that had never required a particular reason. In Chicago, a riot lasted nearly 2 weeks and killed dozens, wounded hundreds, left thousands homeless. In Elaine, Arkansas, a confrontation between black sharecroppers attempting to organize and white landowners backed by armed mobs left somewhere between 100 and 240 black Americans dead. Estimates vary because record-keeping in such moments tends to serve the interests of the powerful. In Washington, D.C., mobs attacked black neighborhoods while police stood aside or participated. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, the thriving black community of Greenwood, known as Black Wall Street, was attacked and largely destroyed. The men who came home from France walked into this. Men who had spent nearly 2 years fighting for a country that was now, in some cases, actively trying to kill them. Men who had the Croix de Guerre on their jackets and could still be denied service at a lunch counter 3 blocks from their homes. Men who had been decorated by the French Republic for extraordinary valor and could still be lynched in the American South for no reason that would pass scrutiny in any court that took law seriously. The cognitive dissonance was not subtle. It was total. It was the kind of contradiction that lives in the body as a specific physical sensation, a tightening in the chest that never fully relaxes, a vigilance that cannot be put down even when the immediate situation does not require it. Veterans of the 369th navigated this the way black Americans had always navigated the contradiction of their citizenship, with a combination of endurance and resistance, and the refusal to let the contradiction define their sense of themselves, because the alternative was a kind of psychological collapse that they had not survived the Western Front in order to permit. Some of them were changed by the war in ways that made the return more difficult rather than less. The specific thing that combat does to the human nervous system was not understood in 1919 with any clinical clarity. The term shell shock existed and pointed roughly in the right direction, but the understanding of what we now call post-traumatic stress was in its earliest and most inadequate form. Men who were experiencing what would now be recognized as combat trauma were told to pull themselves together, to be grateful they had survived, to get on with things. The resources that might have helped them were not available, not to soldiers in general, and certainly not to black veterans, whom the VA system and the broader medical establishment treated with the same casual indifference that characterized every other American institution's relationship to black life. Henry Johnson came home to a hero's welcome in Albany that matched what he had received in New York, and then to a life that the heroism could not sustain. He was not physically the same man who had gone to France. 21 wounds leave marks that are not only on the skin, and Johnson's body carried the cost of what he had done in no man's land in ways that limited what he could do afterward. He had difficulty holding steady work. The railroad porter job that had defined him before the war was not readily available to a man whose physical capacity had been permanently altered by combat. He gave speeches, appeared at events, was celebrated at public occasions. The black community did not forget him, even when official America chose to. But the gap between the public recognition and the private reality was enormous, and Johnson lived in that gap with a difficulty that is painful to read about in retrospect. He had received no pension from the American military, no disability compensation, no medical support for the wounds that affected his daily function. The United States government that had benefited from his extraordinary service under the French flag declined to formally acknowledge that service in any way that would cost money or require institutional attention. Henry Johnson, who had fought 24 men alone in the dark and been decorated by France for it, was essentially left to manage the consequences on his own. He died in 1929, at roughly 32 years of age, in poverty, without the recognition that his service had earned. The specific cause of death was recorded as tuberculosis, but the broader cause was a country that had used him and discarded him with the thoughtless efficiency that characterized its treatment of black veterans for most of its history. It would take nearly a century for the United States government to formally acknowledge what Henry Johnson had done. In 2015, 97 years after the night in no man's land that made his name, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the American government can bestow. The delay was not an accident or an oversight. It was the result of a systematic pattern of exclusion that affected black veterans of World War I across the board, a pattern that historians have documented with painful clarity. Black soldiers recommended for the Medal of Honor, whose recommendations were suppressed, downgraded, lost in processes that seemed designed to reach predetermined conclusions. The Medal of Honor came in 2015. Henry Johnson had been in his grave for 86 years. James Reese Europe's story ended before even that delayed justice was possible, and it ended in a way that felt, to the people who loved him and knew what he represented, like something the world could not afford. Europe returned from France as a figure of considerable renown, the musician who had brought jazz to Europe, the officer who had led the regimental band of the Harlem Hellfighters, the man who had shown that black musical culture belonged on every stage in the world. He had plans. He was going to record. He was going to perform. He was going to use the platform that the war had given him to continue the argument he had been making his entire professional life, that black creativity was not a curiosity or an entertainment, but a contribution to human culture that deserved the same recognition as any other. In May 1919, during a performance intermission in Boston, James Reese Europe was stabbed by a member of his own band, a drummer named Herbert Wright, during a backstage altercation that grew from a grievance about the performance. Europe died from the wound shortly after, at 39 years of age. Harlem received the news with the particular grief that communities feel when they lose someone who was carrying something larger than himself. Europe had not been just a musician. He had been a demonstration, walking and breathing and making music, of what black excellence looked like when given room to operate. His death removed that demonstration from the world at a moment when it was most needed, when the Red Summer was building toward its terrible peak, when the arguments about black capability and black humanity were being answered in the worst possible ways by white violence, and when the music that Europe made would have been, as it always had been, both a comfort and a counter-argument. He was given a public funeral in New York that drew thousands. He was buried with honors. And then, in the way that the careers of black artists in early 20th century America often went, his specific legacy began to fade from the mainstream historical record, surviving in the memories of the community that had known him, and in the scholarly work of researchers who understood what he had done, but absent from the larger narrative of American cultural history that should have placed him among its essential figures. Colonel William Hayward, the white attorney from Nebraska, who had built the regiment and fought for it and demanded that it be given its chance, returned to civilian life with the satisfaction of a man who had been proven right. He spoke and wrote about the regiment for the rest of his life, advocating for recognition that was slow to come, maintaining contact with veterans, working to ensure that the record of what the 369th had accomplished was preserved even when official channels showed little interest in preserving it. He was not a perfect man. he operated within the racial assumptions of his era in ways that limited his advocacy, even as his genuine belief in his soldiers transcended those assumptions. But he had done what he said he would do. He had gotten them to the front. He had fought for them while they were there. And he continued fighting for them afterward with the persistence of a man who understood that what was owed them was not being paid. The regiment itself continued to exist as a National Guard unit, reorganized in the post-war period and maintaining the traditions that the Hellfighters had established. It remained segregated, as the American military would remain until President Truman's executive order in 1948, 30 years after the armistice. The men who had fought in the integrated dignity of the French Fourth Army came home to a military that still insisted on the segregation they had left behind. The logic of this was not military logic. It was the logic of a social order that needed to be maintained, and it was maintained at the cost of military effectiveness and human dignity for another generation. The black community did not allow the story to be erased, though the erasure was attempted in the ways that American mainstream culture has always attempted the erasure of black achievement, through omission, through the simple failure to include in the national narrative what the national narrative finds inconvenient. The white press that had minimized the 369th's achievements during the war continued to minimize them afterward. The histories of the First World War that were published in the 1920s and 1930s mentioned the regiment briefly, if at all, and when they mentioned it, they did so with the kind of condescension that converted extraordinary accomplishment into a charming footnote. They had changed history, not completely, not in the sweeping, immediate way that their sacrifice had deserved. The war had not ended American racism. The parade had not changed the laws. The decorations had not opened the doors that Jim Crow had bolted shut. But something had shifted. Something in the architecture of the possible, in the evidence available to anyone willing to look honestly at what the 369th had done. It was harder after 1919 to make the argument that black men couldn't fight. The argument was still being made by people who needed to make it and were willing to ignore the evidence. But the evidence was there, in the French records, in the testimony of Allied officers, in the formal intelligence warnings the Germans had issued about a regiment they had initially considered beneath serious concern. The laughter in the German officers' quarters had stopped somewhere in the forests of the Argonne. The contempt that had characterized the American military's attitude toward its black soldiers had been answered, conclusively and publicly, in 191 days of frontline service that no honest assessment could minimize. What the men of the 369th were about to discover, in the months and years after the parade came down Lenox Avenue and the crowds went home, was that honest assessment was not always what America was prepared to offer. That the evidence could be present in the world without being absorbed by the institutions and the culture that needed to change. That proving something and having it acknowledged were two entirely different things, separated sometimes by decades, sometimes by generations, sometimes by the entire span of a human life. Henry Johnson proved it in 1918 and died without acknowledgement in 1929. The regiment proved it across 191 days and waited nearly a century for the Congressional Gold Medal that finally recognized what France had recognized in the moment. The distance between proving and acknowledging, that gap, measured in years and in lives and in the specific human cost of being right about something that power refuses to admit, is the final and perhaps most important part of this story. And it is the part we turn to now. There is a particular kind of injustice that history produces when it decides to forget on purpose. Not the forgetting that comes from the passage of time, the natural erosion of memory that affects everything eventually, the way details blur and names fade, and the texture of lived experience becomes smooth and abstract as the years accumulate. That kind of forgetting is inevitable, and in some ways, merciful. What happened to the story of the 369th Infantry Regiment was different. It was the other kind of forgetting. The deliberate kind. The institutional kind. The kind that requires active effort to sustain, because the truth keeps trying to surface and has to be pushed back down again and again by people who need it to stay submerged. Understanding why that forgetting happened requires understanding what was at stake in the telling of the story. If the Harlem Hellfighters were acknowledged, fully and officially, and without qualification, as what the French military had recognized them to be, one of the finest combat regiments on the Western Front, decorated with France's highest honors, sustained through 191 consecutive days of frontline service by a combination of discipline and courage and collective will that no honest military assessment could diminish, then a certain set of arguments became impossible to make. Arguments that American institutions needed to keep making. Arguments about the natural inferiority of black soldiers, the inherent unsuitability of black men for positions of responsibility and trust, the reasonable basis for policies that excluded black Americans from the full rights and dignities of citizenship. The story of the 369th was not just a military story. It was evidence in a legal and moral case that had been argued in America since before the country's founding, and evidence that powerful interests need to suppress get suppressed, not always through a conscious coordinated conspiracy, but through the accumulated individual decisions of people in positions of authority who understand, without needing to articulate it explicitly, what acknowledging certain truths would cost them. So the white press minimized the story during the war and ignored it afterward. The official histories of the First World War, published through the 1920s and 1930s, gave the 369th cursory treatment, at best, dismissive treatment, at worst. The War Department's post-war assessments of black military performance in the Great War managed to take the evidence of what the Hellfighters had done and interpret it in ways that somehow reinforced the prejudices the evidence should have dismantled. Reports were written. Conclusions were reached. The machinery of institutional racism, which does not require malicious intent in every individual operator in order to produce malicious outcomes, continued to function. The soldiers who had lived those 191 days came home to this silence and navigated it the way they navigated everything else, by continuing to exist and continuing to insist on the reality of their own experience, even when the official record declined to confirm it. The veterans gathered. In the years immediately following the war, the men of the 369th formed associations and held reunions and maintained the connections that the trenches had built. These gatherings were not simply social events, though they were that too. The particular warmth of men who had shared something extreme coming together in the safety of peacetime to remember what they had shared. They were also acts of preservation. By gathering, by telling the stories to each other and to the next generation, by insisting on the reality of what had happened in France in conversations that official America wasn't having, the veterans kept the truth alive in the only place it was being maintained, in the community that had produced these men and loved them and waited for them and welcomed them home. The black press continued its work of documentation and celebration. The Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the New York Age, the Baltimore Afro-American. These publications understood their function not merely as news organizations, but as institutions of collective memory, keeping records that official channels were declining to keep, honoring achievements that official channels were declining to honor. Journalists who had covered the regiment during the war wrote retrospectives. Editors who understood the stakes kept the names alive. Henry Johnson, Needham Roberts, James Reese Europe, the regiment itself, in the ongoing conversation about black American life. This is one of the things that the story of the 369th teaches about how communities survive the attempts to erase them. You do not need institutional sanction to tell the truth. You need determination, and you need a medium, and you need an audience that understands why the truth matters. The black press had all three, and it used them, and because of that use, the story of the Harlem Hellfighters was never entirely lost, even when it was being actively suppressed everywhere else. The Harlem Renaissance, which flowered through the 1920s, drew energy from the specific confidence that the war experience had generated in black communities. The veterans of the 369th were not all artists or intellectuals, but they were present in Harlem as the Renaissance happened around them, as Langston Hughes was writing poetry that captured the texture of black urban life with a precision and beauty that the literary establishment was being forced to acknowledge, as Zora Neale Hurston was documenting the richness of Black Southern culture with an anthropologist's rigor and a novelist's gift, as painters and sculptors and musicians were producing work that insisted on the full complexity of Black American experience at a moment when the broader culture preferred simpler and more degrading stories. The Hellfighters fit into this context in ways that were not always explicit, but were structurally important. They were evidence. Living, present, neighborhood evidence. That the story America told about Black men, primitive, cowardly, incapable of sophisticated thought or sustained discipline or genuine courage, was false. The men who had held the Argonne sector for 191 days were walking through the same streets where the Renaissance was happening, and their presence was a rebuke to every limitation that the broader culture was still trying to impose. The Second World War came and took another generation and produced its own histories of Black military service. The Tuskegee Airmen, the 92nd Infantry Division, the 761st Tank Battalion, with their own stories of extraordinary performance in the face of institutional indifference and active hostility, their own struggles for recognition, their own delayed and inadequate acknowledgments. Each new generation of Black soldiers had to fight the same argument that the Hellfighters had fought, had to prove the same things against the same resistance, had to demonstrate repeatedly what should have been settled once and never revisited after the forests of France. This repetition is its own kind of injustice. The fact that each generation had to start more or less from scratch with the argument that the evidence accumulated by previous generations was not treated as established and definitive, but had to be rebuilt from the ground up, reflects the specific mechanism by which institutional racism sustains itself. It is not enough to prove something once. You have to prove it again and again, because the system that benefits from disbelieving your proof will find reasons to require fresh proof indefinitely, and the cost of providing that proof is paid in blood by people who deserve not to have to pay it. The integration of the American military came in 1948 with President Truman's Executive Order 9981, which declared equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed forces regardless of race, color, religion, or national origin. It was a landmark moment. It was also measured against the timeline of Black military service, 30 years late. 30 years after the Hellfighters had proved in France that the segregation of the American military was not a military necessity, but a social choice. A choice made at the expense of military effectiveness and human dignity in order to preserve a racial hierarchy that the Constitution theoretically prohibited. 30 years. In those 30 years, another world war was fought with a segregated American military. Another generation of Black soldiers had to fight in separate units under the same assumptions that the 369th had demolished. Another generation had to make the same argument, pay the same price, and wait for the same grudging acknowledgement. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s drew on the legacy of Black military service in ways that were both explicit and implicit. Explicit in the arguments made by civil rights leaders who pointed to the service of Black soldiers in 2 world wars as evidence of the hypocrisy of Jim Crow, men who had died defending democracy abroad being denied democracy at home. Implicit in the confidence and the organizational capacity of Black communities that had been built partly through the experience of collective action under pressure that military service, for all its degradations, had also provided. The veterans of the 369th, who were still alive in the 1950s and 1960s, watched the movement with the particular perspective of men who had been fighting the same fight for 40 years. Some were actively involved. Others were older, more tired, carrying the accumulated weight of decades of resistance in bodies that were beginning to fail. All of them understood what was being fought for, because they had been fighting for it since before most of the movement's young leaders were born. The formal recognition of the 369th service came in pieces, over decades, in a process that was never fully adequate, but moved in the right direction with what was, given the scale of the debt owed, agonizing slowness. In 1991, the state of New York recognized the regiment's service with formal ceremonies that brought together the descendants of Hellfighters and the still-serving members of the 369th Successor Unit in the National Guard. It was a significant moment, genuinely felt by everyone present, and it was 63 years after the men had come home to their Harlem parade. In 2002, Henry Johnson was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration available. It was again a genuine recognition. It was also 84 years late and insufficient. The Medal of Honor that Johnson had actually earned was still 13 years away. That award came in 2015, when President Barack Obama presented the Medal of Honor to a descendant of Henry Johnson at a White House ceremony that acknowledged explicitly what had happened. Not just that Johnson had been extraordinarily brave, but that the system had failed him, that his recommendation had been suppressed because of his race, that the delay between the act and the recognition was not an administrative oversight, but a consequence of systematic discrimination. Obama said at the ceremony that Johnson and soldiers like him had waited long enough. The phrase was accurate and restrained, and did not begin to capture the full weight of what 97 years of waiting actually meant. The life that Johnson had lived and died without acknowledgement. The family that had carried the story forward through generations without the validation that the Medal of Honor would have provided. The young black men and women across nearly a century who had grown up without Henry Johnson in the official American story of World War I heroism. In 2015, the 369th Infantry Regiment was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the Congress of the United States can bestow. The ceremony in Washington brought together descendants of Hellfighters from across the country, men and women who carried in their family histories the specific inheritance of what their great-grandfathers and great-great-grandfathers had done in France. They sat in the Capitol building and received, on behalf of the men who had earned it, the recognition that had been denied for 97 years. The men who had marched up Lenox Avenue in February 1919, past the crowds that understood what had been done, even when official America didn't, received their Congressional Gold Medal in 2015. Most of them had been dead for decades. Some had been dead for nearly a century. The recognition came, as it so often does, too late for the people who most deserved to receive it in the fullness of their lives. And yet the descendants were there. And they carried something that the delay had not erased. They carried the knowledge that the truth had survived, that the story their families had passed down through generations, in kitchens and at church dinners and at holiday tables, and in the quiet conversations between grandparents and grandchildren that are one of the primary mechanisms through which communities preserve what matters, had been confirmed. Not that the confirmation was necessary for the truth. The truth was true before Congress said so. But there is something that formal acknowledgement provides that informal truth-telling, however persistent, cannot fully replace: the satisfaction of seeing the larger world confirm what the community has always known, of watching the official record catch up to the actual record. The 369th Infantry Regiment still exists today. It is a unit of the New York Army National Guard, now fully integrated, based in Harlem, carrying the Hellfighters designation with pride and the specific awareness of what that designation means. When the regiment's soldiers put on their uniforms, they are putting on something that carries 107 years of history. History that includes 191 days in the trenches of France, a collective croix de guerre, the Congressional Gold Medal, and the names of men whose individual stories have been only partially recovered from the erosion that time and neglect and deliberate suppression have caused. The armory on 142nd Street in Harlem, which served as the regiment's home base for most of its history, was named the Colonel Charles Young Armory, in honor of one of the most distinguished black officers in American military history. Young himself was a victim of the racism that shaped the 369th's experience. He was medically retired on dubious grounds in 1917, specifically to prevent him from commanding black troops in combat, where his rank and his ability would have put him in a position that the Army's racial hierarchy could not accommodate. He rode on horseback from Ohio to Washington to prove his fitness for service, and was denied anyway. His ghost haunts the history of the 369th as a reminder of the talent that was wasted, the leadership that was denied expression, the cost that racism imposes not just on its victims, but on the institutions that practice it. In Harlem today, the physical landscape still carries the memory of the Hellfighters. Streets bear their name. Plaques mark their history. The neighborhood that produced them has been through transformations of its own in the centuries since the regiment came home. The Harlem Renaissance, the Great Depression, decades of neglect and disinvestment, the crack epidemic of the 1980s, the gentrification pressures of the 2000s. And through all of it, the memory has persisted, kept alive by communities that understood it as part of their own identity. Children who grow up in Harlem today grow up in a neighborhood that carries the Hellfighters in its name, and its streets, and its institutions, even when they don't yet know the full story behind those names. The knowledge is there to be found, waiting in the plaques, and the armory, and the archives, and the family stories that people are still telling in kitchens and at holiday tables, and in the quiet conversations that pass history from one generation to the next. In France, in the villages and fields of the Argonne region where the regiment fought, there are cemeteries and memorials where some of the Hellfighters remain, men who died far from Harlem and were buried in French soil that they helped defend. French schoolchildren sometimes visit these sites and learn about the American soldiers, the black soldiers who came to help France in the darkest period of its modern history. The French connection to the regiment has persisted through the century in ways that the American official record long declined to match. France remembered, partly because France had reason to remember, had been there, and witnessed, had decorated these men, and seen what they were capable of. Researchers continue to work on the regiment's history, and the work is not finished. Letters surface in archives that haven't been fully cataloged. Photographs are identified that had been stored without names attached. Oral histories are recorded from the oldest descendants of veterans before those voices are lost. Each discovery adds something to the picture, a detail that changes the texture of a familiar story, a name that had been anonymous becoming specific, a moment that had been recorded in official documents as a tactical action becoming, with the right research, something you can inhabit as a human experience. The history of the 369th is not fully known. It may never be fully known because the suppression of black history in America was thorough and persistent, and the losses it caused are permanent in some cases. But more is known now than was known 10 years ago, and more will be known 10 years from now than is known today. And each piece of recovered truth is a small victory against the forgetting that was deliberately imposed. Now let us talk about what this story means. Not in the abstract philosophical sense, not what it means as a chapter in military history, or as a footnote in the story of American racism, but what it means to you, right now, in whatever circumstances have brought you to this story at this particular moment in your life. You are not in the trenches of France. The specific challenges you face are not the challenges of a man trying to maintain his sanity and his courage through 191 consecutive days of artillery fire and night patrols and the accumulated weight of being told your entire life that you are something less than you are. The logistics of your difficulties are different. The scale of the violence you are navigating is, most likely, different. But if you have ever been told that you couldn't do something because of who you are, your race, your background, your class, your gender, your history, then you know something of what the men of the 369th were carrying when they stepped onto the ships in December 1917 and crossed the Atlantic toward a war that didn't want them. And if you have ever decided to do it anyway, then you know something of what they were made of. Think about what Hayward's soldiers actually did. They were not given a fair chance and then performed brilliantly under equal conditions. They were given a worse than fair chance. Systematically denied equipment, training, recognition, command opportunities, and performed brilliantly anyway. They were told by their own military that they were unfit for combat, and then conducted combat operations at a level that the opposing army formally warned its own soldiers about. They were decorated by a foreign government, while their own government tried to import the segregation that government had already decided to reject. The lesson is not that unfairness doesn't matter. It clearly matters enormously and costs enormously. The lesson is that unfairness is not the final word, unless you decide to let it be. The men of the 369th did not let it be the final word. They went to France and wrote a different ending to a story that their country had already decided was finished. Think about Henry Johnson specifically, a railroad porter, a man whose job required the suppression of his own presence, the careful performance of invisibility in white spaces. A man trained by his occupation to be unremarkable, to be accommodating, to be present without asserting presence. And then, one night in no man's land, when the situation required something entirely different from him, he reached past the persona that his world had required him to develop and found what was actually underneath it. Not a railroad porter. Not a man careful about taking up too much space. A man capable of fighting 24 opponents alone, wounded, in the dark, and winning. The question that Henry Johnson's life poses, not just the night in no man's land, but the full arc of his life, including what happened after, is not a comfortable one. It is this. What do we owe to the people whose capabilities we have suppressed and wasted? What is the debt that accrues when a society tells a man his entire life that he is less, and that man spends his entire life having to fight just to perform at the level his potential would have allowed him to perform at without the fight? Henry Johnson died at 32 in poverty. What would he have been? What would he have done? What contribution would he have made to the world if the full weight of American racism had not been pressing down on him from the day he was born? We will never know. That unknowing is part of the cost. The things that people might have done and weren't allowed to do leave no record. They are absences, and absences are the hardest thing to count. Think about James Reese Europe and what his death in 1919 cost American culture. The man who had just introduced jazz to France, who had demonstrated the full sophistication of black musical creation to audiences that were transfixed and transformed by it, who was at the beginning of what should have been the most productive period of a remarkable career, was killed at 39 in a backstage altercation. The music he would have made across the 1920s and beyond doesn't exist. The musicians he would have developed and supported don't have that support in their histories. The bridges he would have built between black musical culture and mainstream American institutions, bridges that were desperately needed and that he was uniquely positioned to build, weren't built, or were built later and by others and at greater cost than they needed to bear. The loss of James Reese Europe is not just a personal tragedy or a cultural footnote. It is a measure of the fragility of genius in a world that does not protect it equally. Think about the regiment as a whole, the 191 days, and what the experience of producing that performance required of the men involved. We tend to look at extraordinary collective achievement and see the achievement, the clean fact of what was accomplished. We look at the Croix de Guerre and the German intelligence warning and the 191 days, and we see something impressive. What we sometimes fail to see, or fail to hold in focus long enough to truly absorb, is what the achievement cost on the inside. The fear that was managed, the grief that was carried, the weight of representing something beyond yourself that presses down on you in addition to the weight of the immediate situation. The specific exhaustion of being a symbol as well as a soldier, of knowing that your failure would be used to justify the oppression of millions of people who are watching and hoping and praying from across an ocean. These men carried all of that. They carried it across 6.5 months of continuous frontline service. They carried it back home to a country that was in the process of violent resurgence of the racism they had hoped their service would diminish. They carried it through the Red Summer and through the long years of Jim Crow's continuation, and through the Depression, and through another war, and into old age, and they carried it with a dignity that the historical record, even in its fragmentary state, captures clearly enough to be unmistakable. That carrying, the sustained act of maintaining dignity and purpose and excellence in the face of conditions specifically designed to make dignity and purpose and excellence impossible, is perhaps the most important thing the story of the 369th has to teach. Not the tactics, not the specific military lessons of what works in a night raid on the Western Front, but the human lesson of what it looks like when people refuse to accept the story that power tells about them. The story that power told about the men of the 369th was specific and detailed and backed by official reports and institutional policy and the consensus of white military leadership. Black men are naturally cowardly. Black men are intellectually unsuited for the demands of modern warfare. Black men cannot maintain the discipline required for sustained combat operations. These were not vague prejudices or casual slurs. They were formal positions, written into military policy, defended in congressional hearings, maintained by the leadership of the American Expeditionary Forces with the authority of official truth. The Harlem Hellfighters took that story and made it impossible to tell with a straight face. Not by arguing against it in words. They had argued in words for years before the war, and the argument had been ignored. By living its opposite, by going to France and doing the thing the story said they couldn't do, and doing it so thoroughly and for so long and under such scrutiny that the evidence piled up beyond any honest accounting's ability to dismiss. They were dismissed anyway, in the short term, by people who needed to dismiss them. But the evidence didn't go away. It lived in the French records and the German intelligence files and the testimony of Allied officers and the memory of the community that had produced these men. And eventually, imperfectly, belatedly, inadequately, but genuinely, it was acknowledged. The acknowledgement matters, but I want to be precise about why it matters and what kind of mattering it represents. The Congressional Gold Medal in 2015 did not retroactively give Henry Johnson the life he deserved. It did not undo the Red Summer. It did not compensate for 97 years of delay. The formal recognition that came at the end of a century-long process of forgetting and recovery does not balance the ledger. The ledger does not balance. There is no accounting that makes it balance. What the recognition does is something different. It adds to the record. It confirms in the official language of the country what the community had always known in the informal language of collective memory. It makes the story harder to suppress in the future because the suppression has now been named, and the naming is itself part of the record. It tells the descendants of the Hellfighters, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who grew up knowing this history through family stories and community tradition, that the country has, however late and however inadequately, admitted what was done and what was owed. That admission is not justice, but it is something. And for communities that have been told their history doesn't matter, every confirmation that it does is worth something real. There are descendants of the 369th alive today who keep the flame burning in ways both formal and intimate. Some are active in veterans organizations, in historical preservation work, in the kind of deliberate institutional memory keeping that ensures the story survives beyond any individual family's capacity to maintain it. Others know the history primarily through family tradition, a great-grandfather who served, a medal that has been passed down through generations, a name that appears in the French records or the old black newspapers. The connection can be thick with detail, or thin as a thread, but it connects the present to what happened in the Argonne 100 years ago, and the connection is real. The 369th Regimental Armory in Harlem, a massive and architecturally remarkable building on 142nd Street, still stands. It has been through periods of neglect and periods of renovation. It is currently home to the active 369th Sustainment Brigade of the New York National Guard. When the soldiers of that brigade report there, they report to a building whose walls have absorbed more history than most structures ever accumulate. The drilling of men who would become Hellfighters, the celebrations of their return, the decades of community use, the reunions of veterans, the education of new generations about what the name on the building means and where it comes from. The building is not just a building, it is a site of memory, the way certain places become when enough significant human experience has occurred within them. Standing in it, you are standing where these men stood, where they drilled in the winter months before the war, where they came back to after France, where their successors have continued the tradition they established. The physical space connects you to the history in a way that reading about it does not quite replicate. France remembers too, in its own way. The French relationship to the Hellfighters has persisted through the century, with a warmth that reflects genuine gratitude, as well as the particular French capacity for cultural appreciation that recognized what the regiment's music was doing, even before the world had a name for it. There are memorials in the Argonne region. There are French towns that still hold ceremonies on November 11th, where the names of the 369th are read alongside the names of the French units that served alongside them. There are French schoolchildren who learn about the black soldiers from New York who came to help France when France needed help, and who learn this not as a footnote, but as a chapter in the story of the First World War that their teachers consider essential. The music endures most visibly. Jazz, which the 369th carried to France in 1918, became one of the defining American contributions to world culture over the following century. Its roots in the Black American experience are documented and acknowledged in ways they were not always acknowledged. The history of jazz is also inevitably a history of exploitation and appropriation, as well as creation and celebration. But the origin is clear, and the connection to what James Reese Europe was playing in the dugouts of the Argonne is traceable through the decades of development that followed. When you hear jazz, when you hear the specific quality of American swing, the rhythm and the feeling of improvisation within structure, the conversation between soloist and ensemble that distinguishes jazz from everything that came before it in Western music, you are hearing something that the Harlem Hellfighters brought to France in the middle of the most destructive war the world had seen to that point. You are hearing what men under extreme pressure chose to play because it kept them human. You are hearing the cultural contribution of a regiment that the American military had tried to confine to labor duty, and that instead changed the sound of the world. That is a legacy that transcends military history. It extends into art and culture, and the ongoing conversation about what Black Americans have given to the country that has so often taken from them, without credit or compensation. The Hellfighters didn't just fight, they played. And what they played was as revolutionary in its domain as what they did in the trenches was in its domain. Both the fighting and the music were expressions of the same thing: a refusal to accept limitations, a determination to perform at the highest possible level in every context available, an insistence on the full humanity of the men doing the performing. What do we do with all of this? What does it mean to sit with this story in 2025, in a world that is, in many ways, unrecognizably different from 1918, and in some important ways, still working through the same fundamental arguments that the Hellfighters were sent to France to prove? It means, first, that we remember accurately, not the sanitized version of the story that removes its most difficult elements, the deliberate suppression, the deaths in poverty, the decades of delay, the active institutional effort to erase what had been accomplished. The full version. The version that includes the Congressional Gold Medal in 2015 and Henry Johnson dying at 32 in 1929, and holds both of those facts in the same frame, because both are true, and the distance between them is the measure of a specific kind of American failure. It means we pay attention to what sustained these men through conditions designed to break them. It was not ideology alone. Ideology is insufficient insulation against 191 days of artillery. It was the man next to you, the band playing in the dugout at night, the letter from home, the specific knowledge that the person sharing your space would be awake when you needed him to be awake, the bonds that human beings build when they are pressed together under pressure, and that become, when they are strong enough, something that can bear more weight than any individual could carry alone. It means we take seriously the argument the Hellfighters were making with their bodies and their conduct and their extraordinary sustained performance. The argument that the limitations placed on human beings by systems of oppression are lies, that people routinely exceed what those systems say they are capable of, not because they are superhuman, but because the systems are wrong. That the cost of those systems, the wasted potential, the delayed recognition, the Henry Johnsons who died at 32 before the world admitted what they had done, is a real cost paid by real people that compounds with interest across generations. It means we think about what we owe to the people who are currently being told that they can't that they aren't, that the evidence against their humanity and their capability has been reviewed, and the verdict has been reached. Because the verdict was reached about the men of the 369th too, and it was wrong, and proving it wrong required an extraordinary price that should not have had to be paid. And it means we hold the full complexity of the story without resolving it prematurely into either triumph or tragedy. It is both. It is the parade up Lenox Avenue, and it is Henry Johnson dying in poverty. It is the Croix de Guerre, and it is the Congressional Gold Medal 97 years late. It is France saying, these men are heroes, and America saying, wait, we're not ready to admit that yet. It is 191 days of frontline service that no other American regiment matched, performed by men who were not supposed to be there in the first place, who had been given the worst equipment and the least support and the most doubt, who had been told from the beginning that they were going to fail, and who decided, collectively and without apparent hesitation, that the people doing the telling were wrong. They were wrong. The forests of the Argonne know it. The French archives know it. The German intelligence files know it. The names on the Congressional Gold Medal know it. The descendants who carry the story forward in their families and their communities and their National Guard unit on 142nd Street know it. The Harlem Hellfighters were rejected by the army that was supposed to claim them. They were given to the French, who gave them what the Americans wouldn't, the chance to prove what they were. They proved it across 191 consecutive days in the trenches of France, in night raids and artillery barrages, and the grinding attrition of a war that was consuming a continent. They proved it so thoroughly that their enemies issued a formal military warning about them. They proved it so publicly that France decorated them with its highest honors. They proved it so completely that a century later, when the country that had doubted them finally got around to admitting what had been done, the evidence was overwhelming, and the admission, though long overdue, was unambiguous. They came back to a country that still wasn't ready for them and navigated that contradiction with the same dignity they had brought to everything else. They lived their lives in the gap between what they had proven and what the country was willing to acknowledge, some of them for decades, some of them for the rest of their lives, carrying in their bodies and their memories something that the official record kept declining to confirm, but that the community around them had never doubted. And then the confirmation came. Late. Inadequately. But genuinely. The Congressional Gold Medal. The Medal of Honor for Henry Johnson. The ceremonies and the acknowledgments, and the recovery of the history by researchers who understood what was at stake in the telling. The laughter in the German officers' quarters became a formal intelligence warning. The contempt of the American military became grudgingly and slowly, and under the pressure of undeniable evidence, something approaching acknowledgement. The attempt to erase the Hellfighters' legacy required constant maintenance across a century, and ultimately failed, defeated by the persistence of truth in the hands of people who refused to let it die. That is the story. Not a simple story, not a comfortable story, not a story that ends with all accounts settled, and all debts paid, and all wounds healed. The accounts are not settled. The debts have not been paid. The wounds are still present in the world, in different forms, under different names, producing the same kind of damage in new generations of people who are still being told what the men of the 369th were told. But it is a true story, and its truth is useful. It is the kind of truth that people can draw on when the weight of being told they can't becomes almost too heavy to carry. The kind of truth that says, look at what they did anyway. Look at what was possible even under those conditions, even with that weight, even against those odds. Look at what 191 days of refusing to accept the limitations others imposed looked like from the outside, looked like to the French who decorated them, to the Germans who warned about them, to the Harlem that welcomed them home, to the country that eventually, a century late, said they were right. They were right. You have been listening to the story of the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry Regiment, the men who were told they couldn't fight and fought for 191 consecutive days, the men who were given to the French because their own army didn't want them and became one of the most decorated American regiments of the First World War. The men who carried jazz to France in the middle of Armageddon and changed the sound of the world. The men who came home to a country that wasn't ready for them and lived their lives in the gap between what they had earned and what they were given and kept moving forward anyway. The German soldiers stopped laughing somewhere in the forests of the Argonne. It took the United States government until 2015 to catch up to what France had understood in 1918. But the truth was always true, even when it was being suppressed, even when it was being ignored, even when the men who had lived it were dying in poverty without acknowledgement. The truth was present in the world, held in the memories of the men themselves and the community that loved them, and the descendants who kept the flame burning through generation after generation of a country that kept finding reasons to look away. The truth survived, and now it has reached you. What you do with it is the next part of the story.